Right, yeah, thanks everyone for risking the snow and giving up your evening tonight, allowing me an opportunity to talk. So I'm David Leach. I'm an Agile coach and Scrum Master here at RS. And I just wanted to share a few of my thoughts and experiences around why organizations scale. The plan for tonight was to talk for about 40 minutes. People want to ask questions as we go through, please do. Was planning on talking about what I'm not going to talk about, then a little bit around why companies go agile, sometimes why it's not successful or deemed to be not successful, a little bit around what scaling means to me anyway, to go over a little bit around the manifesto, mindset and incubation, and then talk a little bit around agile in some non-technology functions, so HR, PMO, finance and a few others. So what I won't be talking about in any real detail is any of the scaling frameworks specifically. So there are a number of scaled frameworks that companies have applied over the years: SAFe, LESS, DAD, Nexus, to name a few. For me, context is everything. I'm not here to say whether one is good and one is bad. There are a number of points for each of the scaled frameworks that can be appropriate for your organization. And there are a number of YouTube videos and books and resources around those specifically online. That said, it's easy for me to say I'm not going to talk about any of them. If you are to Google Scaled Agile, as some of your leaders may, you're going to see LESS and SAFe in particular at the top of those results. And some organizations, rightly or wrongly, take SAFe off the shelf and implement it and see that as going agile. I think it's important to understand some of the principles behind some of those frameworks. And as I say, context is everything. It's not that any of them are particularly good or bad. It's definitely worth understanding, at least at a high level, the objectives of some of those frameworks. There's a good gentleman on Twitter, Agile memes. A lot of people make fun of SAFe. Some of the things he puts on are quite funny. So yeah, if you're on Twitter, have a look at Agile memes. Really doesn't like SAFe. Received this a couple of days ago. It was a job spec looking for experience around SAFe, Nexus, LESS and DAD. The thing I found quite interesting was that they were looking for battle scarves. I don't have any battle scarves. It's lost in translation. I think they meant scars. But scarves may be popular in the future, who knows? I'm also not going to talk to you in any detail about change management. Any organization looking to go agile, for some companies, for some teams, for some people, it is quite a change. There's a lot of good references and books out there around the change process that people go through and supporting them through it. John Kotter in particular has written a book on leading around change. The penguin is from Our Iceberg is Melting. It's quite a nice book to introduce change to people. That book in particular talks about different profiles, different types of personalities within change. And not that any is particularly good or bad, but it's for people to put themselves in the context of change. Am I fearful of change? Am I trying to support the change? Am I trying to block the change? And it's all about a colony of penguins where their iceberg is melting. A lot of people don't believe that the iceberg is melting, so it's how they find evidence and then how they plan to prepare to move icebergs. And so it's quite a nice book for some companies. I've seen it as the reference point to get people talking about the change process in the organization. But I'm not going to talk about it much. So, why companies go agile and sometimes why it's not successful. A little bit of data from Tech Beacon. I think when I looked at this type of data 5 years ago, it was probably the other way up. So I'm quite pleased to see how things have evolved. You're now seeing the fact that agile enhances collaboration between teams and increases quality as being the things at the top. Time to market and cost of development are still important but are at the bottom. I think a few years ago, as I say, that was flipped the other way up. A lot of people, when they talked about agility in their organization, wanted things quicker and cheaper. Sometimes that's what happens, but I think aiming for collaboration between teams and customer satisfaction is probably the right way to go as your kind of leading indicators of success. Top right's an interesting one. I think having been in and around agile teams for sort of 5 or 6 years now, I would hope that a lot of organizations are now agile or thinking about agile, but it's not until you look at the data that actually you look there a lot of organisations, only 16% are pure agile, 24% have a hybrid implementation, and only 51% are leaning towards it. So there's a lot of teams, a lot of companies out there that are still dipping their toe into the water around what does agile mean to us? How might we implement it in our organisation? So it's good for us. I think as agile evangelists, we've got a lot of experience to share with the rest of the community to help people, teams, organisations understand what agility means and how to apply it. So a little bit of data around, hopefully, so why it's not successful. So a lack of clarity, reliance on legacy methods, inadequate experience, lack of collaboration in teams. I think over this side, a company philosophy at odds with core agile values. I think a lot of what we'll talk about is, when I talk about agility in organisations, it's about the values and the principles. And I think it's difficult sometimes for companies to get their heads around, but what are truly the values of our organisation? And is that at odds with what we talk about in the Agile Manifesto, which we'll come on to later? Lack of experience, lack of management support, inconsistent practices and process, external pressure. Again, it's another thing for a lot of the retail organisations in particular, floated on the FTSE. We have shareholders, we have to meet certain targets to pay dividends. These things are things we have to consider when we're talking about things internally, being able to fail fast and react to change. Are these things at odds with how we're talking externally? There's a lot to consider around whether an agile implementation is successful or not. My clicker's playing up. So, company Atlassian, you might be familiar with through products such as Jira and Confluence. They themselves, they don't just produce agile tools, they actually follow an agile methodology. One of the things they talk about is you treat the implementation of agility in an agile way. I've worked in a lot of companies where we want agile ways of working, but the change to the team structure or the tooling or the methodology, the training, is all really done in a kind of waterfall way. It's seen as a project with a scope and an endpoint. Now, Atlassian is saying you have to treat the implementation of agile as an agile process. So making sure you've got just enough process, giving leadership visibility, transparency and responsiveness to change. So it's all about the fact that you understand the reasons why you want agility in your organisation and be open to the fact that you're going to have to respond to change when you do it. Some things you try with some people, some teams, may not have the impact that you expected, so be open to change. I mentioned there the word organisation. That again is another interesting one. There's two definitions for organisation online. The first one is a group of people with a particular purpose and with ownership, but the more common definition is, should have had so many transitions, should I? I've brought my laptop out. The way in which elements of the whole are arranged. That's the more typical definition that you'll see for an organisation. What that typically then means, that alludes to a kind of a restructure. Now, I'm not saying that an internal restructure is a good thing or a bad thing, but implementing agility in your organisation is not purely just going to be changing where people sit and changing reporting lines. That might be part of it, but we're looking here to gather groups of people together around a purpose and giving them ownership. And it's not just jumping straight to some sort of big restructure. So, scaling. Are we scaling values? Are we scaling teams? We're not scaling clickers. Are we scaling frameworks? Are we scaling methodologies? And again, this is an important question in our organisations. What do we mean by scaling when we're talking to each other? Are we talking about the fact that we've got one team that's doing a particular agile methodology like Scrum and we want 10 of them? That in itself will bring opportunities and challenges for you to solve. Are we talking about the framework itself? Are we talking about the values? A lot of what I'm talking about when I mean agility is the values and principles. That kind of brings me onto the manifesto. I used to shy away from showing people this. I used to see it as a given. The manifesto has been around for so long, everyone's seen it. And actually now I tend to bring it out quite a lot, just to make it very clear to people when we're talking about agility. Let's not forget that there's been decades of companies trying to find a more efficient, effective way to work together. And this is where the manifesto was born from in 2001. So it doesn't hurt to show people when we talk about agility, we're talking about a group of people following the Agile Manifesto. So, starting to have some conversations that, we're starting to value in our organisation, responding to change and collaborating with our customers and having working software, delivering value early and often. Start to talk and not be afraid to talk about the manifesto itself, the principles and the values of Agile. So how can we start to embrace some of these values and principles? Again, in some organisations, particularly enterprise organisations, you'll start to see the sense of we want to pilot Agile in some way. So we want to pilot with a particular team, or I've worked in a number of organisations now where we have an innovation hub or centre or office. So we open up a new office, recruit a new team of people, and we pilot working in an Agile way. I think, again, the important principle here is that we make clear the objective of why we're trying to do that. Why is it we want to be Agile? Why have we set this new team up? What are they trying to achieve? And again, I think sometimes it's too easy to go to the very tangible because we want to build some code. We want to write some code and build a feature and release it to customers. And it's trying to be very transparent about what the team's doing. Because again, we're talking here about trying to deliver value early and often to customers. So is the team doing that or not? If you set up a team in a big organisation and try and give them Agile ways of working and all of the process and tools and autonomy around that, again, just be very transparent about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And if things aren't working, then again, be very transparent. It's not just hide them away until they build something amazing and then say Agile is the best thing in the world. Again, it's being very transparent about what you're doing. So we've got a sense of why we'd want Agile ways of working, and we have acknowledged some of the reasons why it's not successful in our company. We've talked about aligning values with the values of Agile, and we've potentially run a bit of a pilot in our organisation, and we understand what scaling means to us. For me then, sometimes when you've got these successful pilots in technology, it's understanding how are you working with the rest of the departments around, or divisions around the organisation. Because really, whilst you can have some success in a technology function, you are going to start to expose some of the constraints with the rest of the organisation. We talk an awful lot in Agile about mindset. So again, it's important to have these conversations, particularly with our HR and people teams. What is it we understand and mean by mindset? We're starting to talk here about people's behaviours, people's attitudes. So again, it's not to be afraid to have these conversations with our HR teams. We talked about change management earlier on. We want to bring people in our organisation together on this journey with us. And so we need to understand ourselves. What is it we actually mean by an Agile mindset? What are we expecting from people from a behaviour point of view? And it's starting to talk about actually how do we hire people? How do we recruit new people into our business? We talk a lot again around problem solving and curiosity and creativity, but then how often do we jump into a competency-based interview where we just fire questions at somebody for an hour and then we make this huge decision to bring them into our teams? And again, if people don't understand from a behaviour and a mindset point of view, it can have a really destructive impact on your high-performing team. So again, make sure that your recruitment processes are collaborative. Make sure that the teams themselves are involved in that process. Again, far too often, if you need an engineer in your team, engineering will take care of the recruitment and then we'll drop them in. And it's just understanding the impact that could have on the teams around you.
But on that point, actually taking the engineer or developer, wherever they are, and actually having them sit with the team, I found historically is a fantastic way of finding out whether their personality sits with the team.
Absolutely. Yeah.
HR departments seem to, as a collective, have a real kind of fear around doing that. Because, you can do competency-based, you can sit in a clean room and have them typing some code. It doesn't actually prove anything.
No, that's right.
It's not real world. Whereas actually dropping them into the space, like we're at the moment looking for an engineer, actually having them come in and sit with the team for half a day.
Yep.
And see their personality. Boy, you have to sort of manage that and go, okay, they're not going to be full-blown personality, but just to see how they interact is worth its weight in gold.
Absolutely right. Yeah, as I say, the worst thing we can do is bring someone into a team that doesn't want to collaborate, listen. It's all those kind of softer skills that we talk about, but if someone's going to come in with a very strong personality, that's great, but if, as I say, they're not going to collaborate and work well with the team, just taking those few hours just to understand that is really important. Yeah, this is an interesting one. Another statement, your top 20% of talent will produce at least 50% of the output. The word output itself is an interesting one because we start to talk more about outcomes. But, again, most people don't come to work to do a bad job. So when we talk about moving to more agile ways of working, and we talked earlier on about structure and potential restructures and the organization chart, it's going through that change management process. It's almost a time to reset, to make it clear to people, what's the vision of the organization, what's the purpose, what are our values, how does that align to agile ways of working, and what do we expect from you? It's almost an opportunity to reinvigorate some of the people that might have become disengaged. But this is always an interesting point, because you're potentially saying, 80% of your organization are not being as engaged and as productive as they possibly could be. So let's have these open conversations. If there's people in your teams that are disengaged, are not being as productive as possible, again, bringing in agile ways of working, we are encouraging people to be more open about how they feel. So hopefully, if you're asking people how they feel, we're going to be able to listen and use that data to inform how we improve as an organization. Another interesting one is around managers, mentors, coaches, and leaders. And it's understanding that there's a difference between those four things. Now, some people want to be all four, some people want to be one, and some people want to be none. So again, it's understanding leadership as a skill or acquired ability. So it's giving people a framework to learn, understanding who wants to take on a leadership role in a team. We talk a lot about different types of leadership in Agile. Scrum Master role itself, we talk about servant leadership. But again, it's trying to make it transparent to people what these things actually mean. Again, in some organizations, in an engineering function, the only way to progress is to be promoted, and the only way to be promoted is to manage staff, to have people in your care. And that's a huge responsibility. Some people really want that, and some people really don't. So it's trying to prepare people in the best way. What does it mean to be a mentor, a manager, a coach, a leader? And give people the support in their career on that path. And try and make things a little bit more modular, perhaps. So there's not just this fixed path of the only way to move up the hierarchy is to manage more and more people and to have bigger and bigger budgets. Actually, mentoring somebody in your team might be a natural. I've worked with some great mentors, and they're not particularly comfortable managing. But in one organisation I was in, that kind of meant the same thing. So it's just working with HR to understand the difference. So we understand why we're going Agile. We've piloted it in technology. We're talking about values and principles. We are working with our HR teams to make sure that we are recruiting people in a collaborative way, bringing great people into our organisation that match the values, and we're talking a lot about mindset and behaviour. Governance is another interesting one. Far too often I see governance and the PMO being worked around or ignored. Now, things such as Kanban, they talk a lot around understanding your current state, understanding where you are. And I think it's important, being an Agile evangelist, trying to respect what's already in place. People are working in a certain way, whether you deem it to be slow, bureaucratic, political. People are often working in a way because that's how it's been for decades. We're coming along and saying, well, this is all terrible and it's inefficient and we need to do stuff over here. And again, it's part of that change management process. Do people in the PMO understand what agility is? Do they understand some of the constraints that we're working to when we're trying to be faster to market, when we're trying to collaborate with customers? And so it's working with these teams just to understand, what are the things that we're currently doing and why are we currently doing them? Having again, I've been on the other side of the fence where I'm asking an Agile team to have more governance, to have more bureaucracy. And I was nearly marched out of the building because they hated the word governance. It's not a bad thing. In large organizations in particular, just because we're looking for more agile ways of working doesn't mean that risk and dependency and constraints and all these things magically disappear. Most big organizations will be on a multi-year, multi-million-pound journey to get to a point where they're lowering risk and reducing dependency. But we're years away from that. And so it's actually using the expertise in these teams to make sure that we're getting the right levels of support, we're getting the right levels of training. It's not that project management and governance and PMO is bad. It's how we learn from each other. We can be critical, as I say, in some of the ways that things were managed in the past. Far too often a project would have a post-implementation review and its documentation would go on a drive somewhere or would never get looked at. But at least the process was going through of trying to understand how we improve next time. So it's just trying to join these things together as best we can. Again, people often don't like the word resource. Words change behaviour. If we accept the fact that we care about people, resource management is still a thing. People are one type of resource potentially. But again, resource management, the objectives of it were not a terrible thing. We're aiming for teams to be more long-lived, to have ownership of a customer value stream. But there's still some things within resource management that I think we can take a lot of things from. On the right-hand side, that's delivery mapping that Dan North talks about. And I think there's some real value here. I think the only difference is, rather than looking at a resource pool and a list of projects and trying to understand skills, it's trying to tie up the third circle in the Venn diagram. It's trying to understand what things do people in the organisation know and what's their proficiency level. So still that skills audit. What are the things based on our strategy that the business needs? And then overlay, based on the things that the business needs in the future, where's the kind of skills gap? I think for me the holy grail is encouraging people internally that want to teach, making them aware that there are people that want to learn, and making them aware that there's skills that we need. And if you can get to a place where there might be a project coming up or a product development coming up in 6 months' time that needs more React expertise, if you've got people internally that want to learn React and people that want to teach it, that's amazing. Let's not worry about vendors and recruitment. That's really time-consuming and expensive. If we can encourage that learning environment internally. A lot of companies talk about 10% time. If we can use that 10% time to upskill the people in the teams, then hopefully everybody wins and we get a lot of motivation from that. Full stack and specialists and T-shape, again, is another interesting thing to talk about. We talk about the T-shaped person a lot in Agile, and this kind of sense of specialists being a really negative thing. Mike Cohen in particular used a really good analogy around people that work in a coffee shop. You walk into a coffee shop and there's 10 staff and 9 of them are on the till and 1's in the kitchen. You're going to get your order taken straight away, but you're going to wait forever for your sandwich. That's not good. You go to the next coffee shop and they've got it in reverse. 1 person taking the orders, 9 people in the kitchen. Again, you queue for ages, but you get your sandwich almost immediately. It's not too bad. You go to the 3rd kitchen and they've got a bit of a mix. They've got 3 people on the till and they've got 3 people in the kitchen, and then they've got 4 that can work between both. So again, based on the demand, those 4 people can understand enough about how to work the till. Probably can't change the till roll, but they know enough to make some of the basic sandwiches so that they can be useful in that demand situation. It's not that we're saying everybody has to be a T-shaped and everybody has to be able to do everything. Now, a lot of companies, when they put job descriptions out now, talk about unicorns and rock stars. Be very careful about that. For me, this kind of sense of full stack, we have to be very, very careful with. I've been in teams, again, where we took our database administrator away from his desk and we sat him in a workshop and we all started doing wireframing and talking about user personas. Now, I think we set the context wrong. It was kind of a sense of, being a specialist database administrator is now a terrible thing. You have to be able to draw wireframes and talk to customers. And that made that person extremely nervous. They weren't comfortable. They joined the organization to improve as a database administrator. So again, it's about being transparent. I think we need to talk to the teams about why T-shaped is useful. And I think some people in the team will put their hand up and say, I'm interested to learn a bit more about that. But as I say, on the right-hand side, if we can be sharing the reasons why T-shape's useful and the skills that we're looking for in a business and kind of create that learning environment, I think that's the really positive thing. So, we've got friends in the project management office. We've got friends in HR. Finance is another interesting group. Finance like certainty. And I've worked in a lot of companies where capitalization is an obsession. So capitalization is where, I talked to earlier on as an interest-free loan. So if we want to make £1 million investment in a new feature, and that's going to make a material difference to our business, we can depreciate that over typically a 5-year period. So we pay $200,000 a year. So we defer $800,000 this year. So it makes us look profitable. My understanding of the history of capitalization is it's encouraging businesses to invest in R&D and to invest in positive change for the world, in effect. But we get a little bit obsessed by it. I've been in one company where I wandered around on a Friday afternoon asking project managers if they had spare budget so that I could timesheet against their project code. That's a pretty poor situation, but that's the situation we were in. Everybody had to timesheet. They had to put themselves against a capitalized project code. Pretty inefficient. But it's having that conversation with finance that we're not certain about the outcome. And that's a really uncomfortable conversation to have, because we've pretended in the past that if we make these changes, scope, time, cost, we get a return on investment out the other end. And most people will admit that hasn't happened very often. So I think it's just starting from the context with finance, that we're in a place now with most of our teams, with the technology that we use, that we don't have complete certainty. And so it's talking to them about confidence, talking to them about risk, about the things that we're doing and the things that we're learning. Another interesting behaviour is spending budget to get budget. Again, I've been in teams where we have a certain budget for the year, and if we don't spend it, we don't get that same budget the next year. And again, you're looking for this kind of siloed sub-optimization where teams are trying their best to create the most value they can. But again, it's thinking about some of the policies you have and some of the behaviours that you're creating in your teams. It's having this open dialogue with finance. And again, it's about transparency. Inspect and adapt, being okay if we're wrong. I've worked with one finance director where we went to him, we'd asked for £1 million investment to create a new product, and after several sprints, we went back to him and said, we spent 200,000, and based on the market analysis we'd done, based on the prototype, we had very low confidence that we were going to get the traction in the market that we expected. So our advice was to stop. Now, in that situation, you're going to have two outcomes. Either the finance director sees that as £800,000 saved, or £200,000 wasted. Unfortunately for us, it was the latter. It was very much a case of, I'm almost guaranteed my return on investment because I've got a business case. And we're saying, actually, no, we've in an agile way, we've gone out, we've prototyped, we've created a minimum viable product, and the data is telling us not to proceed. So, again, all of these things internally, you're going to have some very, very interesting conversations with the likes of finance, and this is fine. Finance can support agile ways of working. Essentially, how you get your teams and how you get your investment is going to determine whether you're successful or not with agile ways of working. So again, it's not about working around these teams, it's about working with them and being very open and honest about what we're doing and why we're doing it. That said, I think in the past I've potentially antagonised some of the finance teams because you go into a conversation and you talk about Scrum and sprints and velocity, and you use statements like, well, we don't estimate and we can't tell you when. I mean, you alienate the room immediately. So I think, again, it's trying to understand what data can you use and how can you bridge the gap in language. Yes, we might internally be using burn downs and velocities and points and those sorts of things to try and get a sense of predictability as we go through development. But from a finance perspective, they want to understand, if we make an investment, what's the likelihood that we're going to get a return? And so it's starting to think about, actually from a strategic point of view, how do we prioritise change? From a cost of delay point of view, from payback in weeks, it started to have some of those conversations that actually cost of delay is a pretty good way of benchmarking. Cost of delay divided by duration starts to normalise bigger and smaller changes together. So, if we don't do this thing, we do this thing first. We can talk to finance about when we might see a return on our investment. And again, it's not that some of the figures that you use are precise, but again, let's not be afraid. For me, it's quite straightforward. Typically, if you have a blended rate for the individuals in your team, then you have a fixed cost for your sprint. So fixed time, fixed cost. The thing that's variable is scope. If the scope is variable, then the value that you see a return on is variable. So we can start to understand actually how many sprints we spend on something, then what sort of investment are we talking about? If people want to, then cost per point, cost per sprint. It depends on the person you're talking to, whether those things are palatable or not. Again, it's not about trying to get the best possible cost per point. It's about value generation. But the data is available to us if we choose to surface it.
It's not though. The value is, in some instances, it is measurable.
Yeah.
And that's fine. In many instances, it just isn't. So trying to pretend that it is just where we end up in a lot of bother.
I think if you can align from a strategy point of view, so if you know that the team that you're in and the product that you're working on and the initiative that you're a part of, if you absolutely understand that that's the most important thing for the organisation, you get your context. I think
important is, I get that.
Yeah.
Prioritisation, and we say that yes, it's important, but
yeah.
you couldn't put a figure on it in terms of money. But of course, the cost is very easy to work out. So that's the side that definitely.
We know what we're spending. I think yes, in big organisations, you've got a number of teams working on a number of different things, and if it's a website, for example, sometimes you can't specifically say that exact change we made had this value, but you have to try your best. I think in some way, shape or form, we're trying to understand if we're making a change to the experience in this area, whether it's customer behavior. It might not be monetary, maybe it is behavior. We're looking for customers to return to the site or spend longer on the site. It's trying as best we can it's sometimes too easy to say we can't measure that or it's not possible.
I'm saying don't bother because it's wrong because you can't measure it. So you could say yes, there's a figure on it.
Yeah.
Everyone can do that.
It's an important conversation to have with finance. Again, I think it's about being transparent. If you
So this is more product owner rather than Scrum Master.
Yeah, I think it's supporting each other. Again, it's an important conversation. It's not if you can't put a value on it, then somebody somewhere already has probably. They've just put together a fit. Yeah.
Yeah, because a CEO would never go, well, of course we're not going to put value on it, but that's a bit like saying, he might put a bet on a horse race and check all the form beforehand and give himself the best shot picking the right horse, but still much better to let the horses run and put the bet on as you're going through the race.
But that's where strategy comes in. So
that's where changing their mindset is maybe more important than just putting a finger on it.
Absolutely, and I completely agree. I think for some of the things we've done, it's about reducing calls into a contact centre. For some things, it's regulatory, and it's understanding whether it's strategically aligned, whether it's reducing cost, whether it's something tangible like conversion. If it's not, exactly right. Let's have that conversation. Let's not be afraid to say we're not actually measuring this because we can't put a monetary value against it. And if someone in finance says, well, that's outrageous, we're not spending 200k, it has to go back up to the CEO to say, rather than pretending. And this is really where agility is coming from, this inspect and adapt and transparency. He's trying to just be honest about these things, that actually we can't put value against it, but we all agree as a group that it's an important thing to do.
Could you argue some of those points in terms of some features will be enablers for high-level goals?
Yep.
So you could kind of play it as this feature is laddering up to this goal, which has got this value. So it's not directly got value, but it's an enabler for something else. And
those conversations are really important because from a team point of view, if as a team member you'd hear nothing, actually we can't measure this change, and I don't know how it fits strategically, then you're just putting features out and you have no idea what it's for, what it's enabling, who it's benefiting. So it's important conversation.
I think you're right, but the problem there is conflating that with someone in finance who wants a cost and a value of the benefit.
I guess
and that's where you don't, as Scrum Masters or whoever, PAs or whoever, you shouldn't let that slide. If it is impossible to put a cost on it, just go, what's the point?
And again, I think that's what I'm encouraging is that far too often in agile teams, I feel like we almost have a blank check. We have our development teams and we're spending 30k a sprint, and we're not trying to do these sorts of things.
I kind of argue it's the other way around. So my experience is generally that the business will go out, they'll get a secure budget, so you've got a team which is a fixed sort of run rate.
Yep.
And it's for them to flex the maximum value they can out of the amount of resource they have.
And so if they're saying I'm funding a team for 12 months, then instead of going, well, what we're going to have in 12 months, because they usually use that as the way of saying whether they're going to fund it or not. But if you accept that when you have a chat with these guys, that's really
You're absolutely right. I think all I'm encouraging is that I've worked in some organisations where we've got a multi-million pound budget, and it's kind of cheating. And I think you're losing that commercial acumen. Now, I'm not disagreeing. We were making up fictional business cases before to get fictional money. All I'm trying to say is I think it's important that commercial acumen is still there to a certain extent. So understand what we're spending sprint on sprint, understand the value that we're looking to generate. Because otherwise, I'm a big fan of earned value management. So I'm not sure it's on these slides, but again, it's trying to understand internal rate of return, and we're talking about capitalization. All this stuff is too far away from what we're doing if we don't have any data around what we're spending and the value that we're looking to generate. And finance still have these conversations.
Well, actually, shouldn't everything in theory have a value, whether it's generating additional sales or decreasing costs or
No, it does, but the point is you can't measure it before you've done it.
You can't, but I think that's
you
where
can have an estimation
of it.
But even then, you might as well accept that in some cases your estimate is just based on complete fallacy.
Yeah, I mean, if you're taking
It's
stuff
a
out
hard
of
conversation.
if you're taking stuff out of a process and you've gone to people and almost done an old-fashioned target motion studies
saying, sorry, if you can measure it, don't measure it, because if you can turn it into relative value, definitely do that. But I find that a lot of times you really just can't, but I see a lot of people put a lot of effort checking, using a horse racing analogy, checking the form guide, and he's still just putting a bet on a horse. At the end of the day, nothing will change that. You don't know if that horse is going to run well, there's too many variables, you can try and work them all out, at the end of the day, he doesn't know which one's going to run fastest.
Sometimes it's improve maintainability, so if you improve maintainability, it has no fiscal value.
But all I was saying is it's much better to, if you can change the mindset and get them and find a way for people to understand that, then they might can the project, but that might be better not doing it. But
No, I'm not here to sell a methodology. I think it's very much to encourage those conversations with finance. If we're going to be grown up and have a product to look after and a team to look after, then we have a cost to look after and we have a duty to generate value for our customers and our shareholders. So it's important to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it and as best we can how we're measuring it. And as I say, being transparent.
How many Scrum Masters actually know the value of data?
We just try and think that we put on our sprint summary every month how much that costs, which is around the 30k mark. So 30k per team as an arbitrary sort of figure actually costs per sprint.
Would you say that sprint zero activities would be an example where you might spend one sprint or two sprints, like let's say 4 weeks or 2 weeks, where you set new environments, so getting pipelines set up, getting everything else set up, where that would be really hard to quantify, wouldn't it? Probably no direct value, but if you didn't do that, you couldn't deliver anything in the first place.
Yeah, but again, so I guess what I'm encouraging is an iterative conversation with finance. So if there was a goal we're trying to achieve and we guesstimate it's going to be 3 months, and you go back after 2 months and say, well, all we've done is set our environments up, and we guesstimate and say we spent £120,000 setting our environments up, finance is probably going to say, it's not a very good investment, is it? But it's a conversation. The whole point is that it's an ongoing conversation. It's not, give me £1 million, I'm going to go over here, do agile stuff, come back, because we're going to have the same disappointments we always had. I'm sorry, I wasted that million, we didn't generate any value. It needs, if we're talking about iteration and transparency, we need to have that same transparency with the finance department and not just our own internal teams, I guess is the point.
Something we did ask is we were trying to become connect that, and we were trying to say our goal was to automate as many processes as possible. And it was a similar conversation to finance, was like, we think it's going to be this, but we've actually monitored by our a person, not every single person, so we've gone best guess, this is what we think we're going to save. And after certain iterations and MVPs, we went back to finance and said, okay, actually now I know we're not totally incorrect, we've actually saved you more. And we started gaining a bit more trust with them, so when we were giving them those estimates, it was an easier conversation.
Yeah, and when I've seen it at its probably most negative is where we're trying to make a change to reduce cost, and that money's been taken out of somebody's budget already because it's assumed that the savings that we promised we would make. And the lady was nearly in tears because the budget's gone. It's been reallocated. People potentially lose their jobs in a scenario like that. So it's serious stuff. And exactly that. It's about inspect and adapt, and it's about the transparency of how we're getting on. It's that learning process. So that's conversation with finance. So we're big friends with finance now. We're having some really interesting conversations with them. We've got a good relationship with our people teams. We're recruiting the right people. We understand the values and principles. From a product ownership point of view, this is kind of the next challenge now. All these positive things are happening in the organisation. Actually, what is our product? What do we actually own? Finding and owning your value stream. I think Roman Pitchler, when he spoke late last year, he started to talk more around his kind of view of the purest view of the role of product owner and the difference between feature owners and component owners. And these are all really interesting conversations to have internally. Again, I've worked with a number of product owners that don't feel like they don't have a product to own. They don't feel like they own anything, which, you have to have these conversations. What does it mean to be a product owner? And what do I and my team actually own? What do we feel like we own? Ownership is such an important thing. Phrase you might have heard before is from concept to cash. It's trying to get this sense of the value stream. So the where you tend to see the most benefit is where a team feels like they own something from start to finish. The taxonomy of teams is another phrase. So making sure that the team is looking at the customer experience, the business process, and the technology, all in your cross-functional group. A guy I talk to a lot, George Velmakitis, who works at the Racing Post, he describes it as the team having the knowledge, the ability to decide, and the ability to act. So not just 2, having all of those things together. So again, it's trying to look at your teams, your cross-functional teams, and figure out how best to align them against that value stream. You know, how much of the analytics or the research is happening to the team? How much are we giving a solution to the team? And just constantly challenge these things. Is there a value in your teams that are producing the end product? Is there a value in the teams that are doing the research or the analytics or the testing coming in and being part of that team? Whether it's marketing or sales, I think it's truly starting to challenge what we mean by cross-functional. You know, we talked about finance earlier on. If you're trying to make cost savings in your business and you're trying to reduce a process in the contact center, you know, why not have a contact center person in your team? Why not have a finance person in your team? You know, we talk about products rather than projects. In the project world, you would not have been afraid to have gone, right, these are all the people we need, and you scoop them all up and you have a budget. Again, you know, there were some positive things in there. Yes, some of those people wouldn't be part of that team forever. But again, it's starting to understand who do we need to join our team to get the right result against the problem that we're trying to solve.
Would you have them sort of as a consultant team, or would you have mixed team?
A question to ask. I mean, that's come up with lots of different roles. I think years ago, when user experience when UX was quite new, you might only have one or two in your organization, and you wouldn't be lucky enough to have one in every team. In a lot of companies, it's the same for BAs. I think you have to, you know, it's always going to be suboptimal when someone's working with multiple teams, because they're going to be context switching potentially, and they're going to have to prioritize. Value is value. And again, you know, if we do have a sense of how much our team costs, you know, I've even been questioned as a Scrum Master whether it's valuable for me to be in a team, which is humbling. But again, every person brings a cost, and if you want to drive that commercial acumen in your teams, it's all about driving value for the customer, and it's understanding the investment that we're making. But you know, yes, if you can get that cross-functional group involved and you can work together closely.
I've been in a situation where you've got that sort of main level, don't be scared to ask, but it's a lot of Scrum team of 4 or 5 people, and before you know it, you've got business analysts, system analysts, database experts, you know, the team just gets from 5 to like 20 people.
Yeah.
You start thinking that group thing, and it's just like, we've got a gap, we'll just get someone in there and just fill it, and kind of going, this is just impossible now. Whereas, I know you talk about the T-shaping and getting people to support, but in the beginning, when you're going from, you know, a completely new transformation, people have their expertise. You're not going to get that nice mix of small team,
Yeah.
those things, and obviously you want to get some kind of cadence, but you can't keep putting people in and out of sprints.
No, and I guess it's again, it's going back to, we used to have things like a RACI matrix on a project. They're not bad things. Again, it's looking at, you know, if you're our subject matter expert, again, the negative in the past has been, I come into the room, I tell you what I want, I come back 2 months later and tell you it wasn't what I wanted. And so it's how best do we communicate? What's the frequency? What's the right way to communicate? Maybe that person can come into your stand-ups once a week. Again, it's just having that kind of conversation of how regularly can we communicate with you, and how do we communicate? What do you need to understand? Just trying to understand the outcome that we don't want is that we build the wrong thing. So I think it's just, yes, probably having them in the team full time, unless they're happy to come and sit with you and they can do other things while they're sat with you. Just have that open conversation with them. We see value in you being part of the team as often as possible. How often can you do that?
So we're trying with a couple of our teams here, it's actually not them coming to us going to them.
That's a good point.
So we're going to sit with customer services, and we're looking to spend sort of half a day, a week or a fortnight, just up in that space. Not necessarily with any designated meetings or anything, but just to be there for them, anybody up there to come and say, I believe, you know, you're part of the team that looks at the checkout or my account or this, that and the other. Well, these are really rich customer touch points. Can we come and have a chat with you about what we're seeing, the customer behaviours conservative actually might as well, with all due respect, it might as well be another country for as much as I understand it.
That's a good point. Yep. So yeah, just another point around, there's a book by Sir John Whitmore called Coaching for Performance. He talks in there around managing your system or your organisation based on principles and one that's controlled by rules. And we've talked a lot all the way through this about values and principles. And he talks there around, if you run things based on rules, you're operating at the boundary of what is possible and you're not going to fulfill your potential. So I think one of the reasons why we saw Agile failing in some organisations was because values are not aligned. Your company's values, the behaviours of your teams, and the Agile values. And I think whilst it's a fairly soft subject, it's something that we need to discuss with our leadership teams. What are the values in our organisations? How much are we actually encouraging collaboration, ownership, delivery of value to customers? How much do we understand our customers? We talk a lot around failing fast, not being afraid to fail. Ask for forgiveness, not permission. These are all very nice phrases, but how much is that true in our teams? How much are we really allowing that autonomy? So, just to finish really with the power of why. For those of you that are not familiar with Simon Sinek, I think Coaching for Performance, Sir John Whitmore alludes a lot in there of what he talks about around the understanding of the purpose of what we're doing. For those of you not familiar with Simon Sinek, he's a great speaker. He's taken things one step further. He talks a lot around us as human beings and the sort of the chemicals that are generated when we do certain things. And he's talked about how command and control management, how that impacts us as human beings, and also how that then affects us in our lives, how we interact with other people, our children, our families. I would encourage you, if you haven't, to watch some of his talks online. But we're talking about people, we're talking about values and principles, and when I talk about scaling, it's the values and the principles in your organisation. It's how people work together, and it's coming to work to do something that has some meaning, has some value. So just to finish, if my clicker will let me, just some books that I've alluded to. So Simon Sinek, Start With Why. For those of you that have an interest in the financial side, there's a book called Real Numbers. I was really, really lucky a few years ago. Myself, my technology director, and my head of finance, we read that book chapter by chapter. And we had a conversation after each chapter to understand what we'd taken from it. It talks enough about the generally agreed accountancy principles to make it relevant for finance, and it talks enough about agile and iteration to make it relevant for software. So, really good book to bridge the gap between technology teams and finance. And a few decades old now, but the balanced scorecard. Google have done objectives and key results, but again, some really good techniques in there for understanding how we take the vision of an organisation all the way down to the purpose and meaning in teams. So looking at strategic objectives and measures of success, those sorts of things. So the questions I would ask you are, what are you scaling and why are you scaling? Thank you.